Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take sources you send us and really get into them.
Yeah, we pull out the key bits, the essential knowledge.
Exactly. So you can get a handle on things, without feeling totally swamped. Think of it as your shortcut.
Your fast track to being clued in.
Mm-hmm. And today, well, we're diving into something I found really fascinating.
Me too. One of you sent us parts of the book, 50 Architects, 50 Buildings, the buildings that inspire architects.
Right. So our mission today is to kind of explore what is it about certain buildings? Why do they resonate so much with architects?
The people actually designing our spaces. It's a great question.
It really is. And it goes beyond just like the technical stuff, the nuts and bolts.
Definitely. It's about connections, memories, maybe even ambition, things these buildings spark.
Yeah, digging into the material, what struck me was just how varied the reasons are. It could be something from childhood,
Right. Or very specific design research they were doing.
or even just, a feeling and aspiration for their own work.
And that personal connection seems, well, pretty central a lot of the time.
Totally. Like, take James Sohn. He talks about the Liverpool Playhouse extension.
Ah, yes, that's one of the first examples in the book excerpts we looked at.
And for him, it's not just a building he admires aesthetically. It's like woven into his life story.
How so?
Well, he mentions it was conceived the same year he was born. And get this, his dad was the engineer on the project.
Wow, okay. That's quite a link.
Yeah. He even says there was a picture of it hanging above his father's desk.
So it was always there.
Exactly. He puts it like it entered his consciousness before he even really knew what architecture was. Sort of an early immersion in modern design, almost without realizing it.
That's fascinating. So let's unpack that a bit more. These first encounters, these lasting impressions.
Yeah, the power they hold.
Well, the sources suggest these early experiences can be incredibly potent for architects. Really strong emotions, lasting memories.
And interestingly, it's not always about seeing the building in person first, is it?
No, quite often they first encounter these inspiring buildings through books or magazines.
Right. So they become these almost mythical places in their minds.
Exactly.
Wh-
Then maybe they finally visit them as students and often keep going back, over their careers.
And Sohn's story just nails that early exposure idea, but with that extra layer.
The family connection.
Yeah, the autobiographical link. His father being the engineer. That must have shaped his early grasp of modern architecture, even subconsciously.
It really makes you think about how our surroundings, even things we don't consciously clock, can influence us so deeply.
Definitely. So, connecting this to the bigger picture then, architects aren't just looking at these buildings to like copy them directly, right?
Yeah, it seems much more
Your
subtle.
perspective.
Tim Ronalds, for instance, talks about going back to the Gothenburg law courts.
Okay.
And he says it's not so much to copy ideas or forms directly, rather to recharge my aspirations.
Recharge my aspirations. I love that phrase.
Me too.
It suggests these buildings are like creative fuel, touchstones.
Yeah, something like that. They offer a sense of possibility,
Yeah.
maybe a standard to aim for. And it's not always a conscious direct influence either.
More like absorbing a certain quality.
Precisely. Biba mentions only now starting to see subliminal analogies between her inspiration and her own practice's work.
Subliminal, so it sinks in deep, often without them even realizing it at the time.
Exactly. Marie Jose Van He has this great description. She talks about buildings going into an inner map or a personal library.
An inner library. I like that.
Yeah. And they just sit there potentially resurfacing, unexpectedly later on.
So you might be designing something years later, and suddenly a connection clicks back to one of those buildings in your library.
That seems to be the idea, which brings up another point. What about the stereotype of architects? Sometimes seen as a bit arrogant, detached.
Mm-hmm. Overly confident, maybe.
But looking at their inspirations like this,
Yeah.
it paints a different picture, doesn't it?
It really does. You see these sort of longings, maybe even vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Well, Niall McLaughlin, who runs his own firm, actually talks about feeling envious of the camaraderie within the team that designed his chosen building, ABK.
That's interesting. Appreciating the teamwork.
And it's telling that quite a few architects in the book didn't pick buildings by, superstar architects.
Right.
Instead, they often chose buildings that seemed to represent really good working relationships, often with clients who were inspiring too.
So there's a real appreciation for that whole collaborative energy, the process.
Exactly. So inspiration isn't just visual, it's also about how things get made, the people involved, the values maybe embodied in a building.
Okay, so that leads us nicely into looking at some specific examples. What buildings did they choose and why? Or should we start with the chili house? in Hamburg.
Let's do it. Eric Perry picked that one. He first saw it in like an old publication from 1924.
Wow, an old one.
Yeah, and then later visited on an office trip. So what makes the Chili House stand out?
Well, what's really fascinating is how it blends tradition and innovation. The architect, Fritz Höger,
Okay.
he was steeped in this local Hamburg tradition of brickwork. Backstein architecture, they call it.
Brick architecture, right.
But he used this, seemingly traditional material in incredibly imaginative ways. And in the Chili House, this craft meets the more sort of idealistic, maybe slightly esoteric thinking of the time.
Like expressionism, people like Bruno Taut.
Exactly that sort of vibe. So the real insight isn't just, oh, nice old brick building. It's how Hooger showed that local craft could be totally relevant, even forward-thinking, when combined with bold design. Grounded, but aspirational.
And it wasn't just Herger working alone, was it? There was a collaboration mentioned.
Yes, with the sculptor Richard Kuhl.
Yeah.
He did a lot of the ceramic work.
Ah, okay, so that speaks to that collaborative spirit again.
It really does. Those crafted details emphasize that relationship. But beyond the look of it, Perry also admires it as a really smart response to its city block.
Uh-huh.
And it was a seriously audacious investment at the time by the client, Henry Sloman.
And the name, Chili House. That came from Sloman's business, right? Importing saltpeter from Chile.
That's the story. It really became this emblem of Hamburg.
And it's still there, still largely original, still being used for different things nearly a century on. Perry specifically mentioned the entrance halls.
The glazed ceramic ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. Simple and dignified, he called them. It's a building with real staying power.
Okay, so from Hamburg brick to a coal mine.
Indeed. Our next case study is the Zollverein coal mine in Essen, Germany, chosen by David West and Christoph Egret.
And this feels like a very different kind of inspiration, more about reuse, sustainability.
Exactly. It's this huge industrial site that's been completely transformed into a cultural landscape. The core idea inspiring them seems to be adaptability.
And valuing that industrial history, not just knocking it down.
Right. I think the key takeaway from Zollverein isn't just that they saved it. It's the powerful idea that our industrial past doesn't have to be erased. It could be repurposed.
Turned into an asset.
Yeah, breathing new life into a place, offering a big lesson in sustainability through adaptation. It's often harder to adapt than build new.
Sure.
But Zollverein shows how honoring that past, the grit of the place, can actually fuel its reinvention.
And they kept that raw industrial quality in many of the spaces, didn't they? Except maybe for that shiny red dot museum by Foster Plus Partners.
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
It highlights that efficient, functional aesthetic you get with industrial architecture, which has its own kind of beauty.
Definitely. And the regeneration was massive, right? OMAD did the master plan.
Yep. Then there's the converted coal washing plant, Santa's Design School, Foster's Museum. Now it's used for recreation events.
And it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, too.
It is a really potent example of transformation.
Okay, let's shift to London. Hannah Loftus chose the Economist buildings. She first saw them as a student. What grabbed her?
She mentioned their sort of understated elegance, almost feeling a bit out of place nearby. Well, they felt quite solid, substantial, not super glassy or transparent like some modern buildings. And they created this really interesting public space.
The plaza.
Yeah, the plaza. It felt both intimate, but also kind of anonymous, detached. She was really struck by how the building shaped that space, the experience at street level, too.
And the architects, Allison and Peter Smithson, they did something unusual with the layout, didn't they? The sizes of the towers.
They did. They put the smallest tower on the main street, St. James's Street, and the tallest one tucked away on the narrower side street. Kind of counterintuitive.
Why?
Well, for the Smithsons, the public space, the space between buildings, was absolutely fundamental. It wasn't just a leftover. It was a core principle.
Ah, okay.
And they focused on the details, too, using unpolished Portland stone, letting the joints show.
Giving it texture.
Exactly. But balanced with these very clean, sharp lines overall.
And Loftus felt this really showed their theories in practice. Like you could feel their ideas about urban space.
That's what she suggested. That the physical experience really conveyed their thinking about how buildings relate to each other in the city, about having a sort of neutral character. It was like a built manifesto.
And it still makes you think, even today, still kind of unsettling in a good way.
Definitely has a presence.
Yep.
Okay, one more. Peter St. John picked Oscar Niemeyer's French Communist Party headquarters in Paris.
Niemeyer in Paris, that feels unexpected itself.
Right. St. John first visited back in 1985. And interestingly, he was actually there studying Palladian architecture at the time.
Wow, talk about a contrast. Palladian is all classical symmetry.
Exactly. And then he stumbles upon this very sculptural, very modern Niemeyer building right in the historic center.
What specifically impressed him about it?
He talked about the interior of the main dome, these subtly animated panels on the ceiling.
Uh-huh.
Apparently, they create this weirdly dreamlike illusion, making you feel almost like you're outdoors, even though you're completely enclosed.
That sounds intriguing.
He also loved how the building had different moods, different atmospheres,
Yeah.
like the cavernous underground spaces,
Okay.
compared to the light open offices with their glass walls and then this very dramatic sculptural roof terrace.
It does have a very optimistic, forward-looking feel, doesn't it? That kind of mid-century belief in the future.
Yeah, like a celebration of research, industry, progress, all expressed with this quite theatrical form.
St. John felt it, said something about the future then, and still does now.
A building with a really strong, distinct identity.
Okay, so we've looked at brick expressionism, industrial reuse, subtle urbanism, modernist sculpture. Quite a range.
Definitely.
Looking back across these examples, what are some of the common threads? Why do these particular buildings or types of buildings inspire architects?
Well, a few themes keep popping up. One is definitely the value of going back, of revisiting buildings over time. You see more, understand more deeply.
Right, it's not a one-off visit.
No. Then there's always that interplay between how a building works its function and how it looks and feels the aesthetics.
Yeah.
That balance is key.
Materials and details, too.
Absolutely. How things are made, the texture, the craft that comes up again and again as being really important to the overall experience.
And just the raw ability of buildings to make you feel something, right? To evoke emotions, shape how you see things.
For sure. And maybe finally, that the relationship architects have with these buildings isn't fixed. It evolves as they evolve in their own careers.
So boiling it down, the main takeaway seems to be that architects draw inspiration from this incredibly diverse pool of buildings and for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, and these connections often run really deep. They become lasting influences, shaping their own work in ways that are sometimes obvious, sometimes.
Subliminal.
Exactly. It comes back to that idea of the inner library.
Right, this personal collection of architectural touchstones.
It's like this resource they keep building and drawing on throughout their careers.
Yeah.
It shapes their vision, their approach to design.
This has been really fascinating to unpack, a great deep dive.
Agreed.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listener, to sort of mull over. Think about the buildings that have maybe lodged themselves in your own inner library. You don't have to be an architect.
Not at all.
What makes a building truly memorable or maybe even inspiring to you? How might certain spaces you've known have quietly, subtly shaped how you perceive things, how you understand space and place?
Yeah, it's definitely something worth thinking about.
Maybe the next time a building catches your eye or makes you feel something. Pause for a second.
Consider why. You might learn something interesting, not just about the building, but maybe about yourself too.